they're sitting there and they're imagining a future Nigeria.
It's not a good future Nigeria.
It's
I just
not
want to be
necessarily
clear.
a good future Nigeria, but that's interesting unto itself. Welcome to the Skiffy and Venti Show!
If only she'd walked 2 more miles, she might have died by electricity instead.
Yes, true.
It's true.
Sad.
It's true.
I'm Jen.
I'm Sean.
And today, we've decided to hit the ground running in 2021 with 3 Afrofuturist short films, Afronauts, Z the Beginning, and Pumsy. Sean, could you please tell our audience what Afrofuturism is?
Sure, Jen. So, for those that may not be familiar with the term, it's primarily been coined by a fellow by the name of Mark Derry. Afrofuturism was coined then primarily to refer to science fiction which treated African-American themes and African diaspora themes, specifically within the U.S. context, bringing in things like 20th century technoculture, bringing in issues of identity, and other sorts of things to sort of have an African-American perspective on what a possible future could look like, both good and bad. It has since been sort of modified over time to incorporate more broadly the African diaspora into that perspective, so not explicitly African-American perspectives on futurism and science fiction perceptions, but more recently we've seen somewhat of a shift happening in how people from different national identities have begun to talk about what we mean by Afrofuturism. So Nnedi Okorafor is probably the most well-known proponent of what's referred to as African futurism and its fantasy relative African jujuism, I believe is the term, which in Nnedi Okorafor's perception is that Afrofuturism does not allow, or at least does not allow enough space for sort of African perceptions from the continent of the future, science fiction specifically. And so African futurism is a way of rectifying that by creating a more specific space for African cultural allegory and other kinds of things. So bringing in some of the same considerations, 20th century, or in this case more 21st century technoculture and other aspects into a science fiction imaginary that draws on African culture more specifically. Not everybody necessarily agrees with these two terms, so there is some disagreement over whether or not Afrofuturism really disallows for African cultural expressions, but regardless, that seems to be the predominant perceptions at the moment. There's a lot more here that we don't have time to go over because this is actually a huge academic conversation. There's like 8,000 books now, which is awesome because it means you can go read a lot of stuff. So Tasha Womack, I believe, is the most recent major figure in writing about Afrofuturism, has a book, I believe, called just Afrofuturism, I think is the name. So, yeah, and there are others to read. Derry, this is going back to the 90s with Mark Derry, just to be clear, and Alondra Nelson is another big figure who actually just joined the Biden admin. So, fun fact.
Oh, good job, Alondra.
Yeah, there's a lot more we could talk about, and hopefully someday we can maybe have a pretty big conversation with some people who know considerably more than either of us do, like actual scholars on this particular field. That would be pretty interesting. So, yeah.
In terms of, the difference between Afrofuturism and African futurism, it could be argued that the 3 films that we are going to be talking about today are African futurism specifically, because one is from Nigeria, one is from Kenya, and one is from Zambia by way of Ghana, by way of New Jersey. So, why don't you start us off with Afronauts, because you are the one that told me about it in the first place.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate this, actually, because it leads down a bit of a rabbit hole.
So, Afronauts is a film based loosely on some real events that took place in 1969, involving a Zambian National Academy of Science, Space Research, and Philosophy founder by the name of Edward Festus Makuka Nokoloso. So, he ended up forming essentially a space program, and this program is sort of gone under the radar for a number of decades, in large part because it was a somewhat unusual program. It was also from a country that basically nobody at the time during the space race really considered seriously as a place that might contribute to a space program. Also, Edward Mokuga Nagaloso was a little bit eccentric, to say the least. And so this film takes place on the 16th of July in 1969, which is right around the time of the launch of Apollo 11 in the United States. And all the way over in Zambia, we witness a ragtag group of, we're told, sort of exiles who are working on this space program, preparing, at least in the case of one of the astronauts, Mata, to be launched into space to go to the moon. And that's the basic premise here. Most of the film is about their training and some of the sort of loose conflict occurring, with some overlay of some of the audio from the Apollo 11 launch. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal. It's a very interesting film, and it has an ending, which is not what happened in the real world, which I think is really important.
I love that two of these films have to actually have slightly ambiguous endings that may or may or not involve death.
Yeah.
This being the first one, sadly. But I think one of the things that's also interesting to point out is that this is the space that this National Academy of Science, Space Research and Philosophy was founded was within 5 years of the independence of Zambia from the United Kingdom. So it's super amazing that anybody was audacious enough to even attempt this in any way, shape, or form. However bizarre and surreal the entire experience might have inevitably had been for everybody involved. And I think that comes across really well in this film. It's a fascinating look at what very specifically Mata is going through as the chosen one, so to speak, to go into space with cats. Gotta remember the cats, because the cats are adorable.
They also had names in the credits.
They did. They were all they were named, so that was really cool. I thought it was really interesting. The film is entirely in black and white, but with a slightly sepia tone.
Yeah.
And that was extra effective because of the fact that the actress who portrayed Mata, Deandra Forrest, is albino, or has albinism.
Yeah.
And so they're able to take shots where she practically glows, much like the moon does. And that's helped by the costume design of her, flimsy spacesuit. But she's got this, giant globe over her just puff of hair. And there's a few shots where that's used to just incredible effect in the film. The vision is both striking and as audacious as the original plan.
Insofar as there was a plan.
But it's really beautifully contrasted with the insomuch as it was a plan, because we see these glimpses of how it's just cobbled together, and there's gaping holes in their plot, so to speak.
Well, and this sort of reflects in a lot of ways the very real program, because some of that we get to see recreations of here, right? So there's moments when Mata is being trained for, low G or low gravity or 0G, right? And is basically being put on a big blanket and flung into the air up and down, up and down. And that seems to be the extent. Or there's, these ideas like, well, you're going to be in space for a long time by yourself. And so you have to have a cat for your sociability. And so she spends a lot of time inside this sort of rickety spaceship, as it were, hanging out with these cats.
The timeline is actually fascinating because the film technically starts with the launch and ends with the landing. You get the impression that the, social isolation aspect of it, which we are all very familiar with now, takes place over the 8 days in between those two things. And she doesn't emerge until the day of not the launch, but the landing of the Apollo 11 mission.
Got it. I was so confused for a second.
The African versus the Zambian mission.
I just want to be clear. Everything you said made me think for a moment that we watched completely different films because because you were like, oh, it takes place in, from the launch to the landing, and I was like, wait, which what? Like,
sorry,
because
I mean the Apollo
right
launch and the Apollo landing.
Right, because the end of this has, and as Jen was alluding to earlier, a very ambiguous ending. It's a short film that ends with a launch, right? As Apollo is landing, right, they're launching into space, and she disappears.
Yeah.
And during the entire film, we think one of two things is going to happen. Either this Banana Pants idea is really going to be successful and she's going to go to the moon and all this, or like Auntie Sunday, played by Yolanda Ross, says she's going to get blown up and become fireworks, right? You're just kind of this pawn in this plot. And what happens is she disappears, and so the ship doesn't make it to the moon, but also she's not dead. As far as we can tell, she's sort of been disappeared, and presumably I hope the cat went with her, because if they hurt a cat, I'm going to lose it. There's a lot of interesting things that I think overall about this film. One of the most interesting parts, I think, for me was the section when I believe it's Hoji Fortuna, who plays Nicoloso, who basically gives this speech about when she goes to the moon, she's not to take nation states or Christianity or anything with her. She's presumably, I guess the implication is she's going to meet people there.
Yep.
And so this would go back to some things that in Western literature, I have no idea about the history of African literature preceding colonization, about whether or not there are any sort of ideas about people living on the moon. But in Western literature, there are lots of stories and stuff about that before we knew that nothing could live on the moon, of that very thing, of meeting civilizations. And so that seemed to me, that was the immediate connection I drew, was like, they're really thinking they're going to meet people here. And the message is not bring, a Zambian way of life, right? Bring our culture and our things and impose that upon them. Don't colonize them. Rather, you're meant to be kind of like a messenger to say, like, hey, what up? I'm from Earth. How you doing?
Yeah, that speech and the fact that he calls her mother, I believe, during that speech was also really interesting. Just in the context of the story, and how he basically is expressing that she's their mother, as in essentially it's like he's implanted an idea, and she is carrying it with her, and she's carrying it to fruition, whether or not this succeeds. And meanwhile, in real life, the real Mata apparently got pregnant, which is partially why the effort was ended. That, and probably because
Funding was the big reason.
Right.
Turns out trying to go to space ain't cheap.
No, it isn't. And Mata is almost this passive character.
Yeah.
But not entirely, because she's still determined to see this through, and maybe not for the right reasons. She says something to Auntie Sunday like, well, where else am I gonna go?
I think that's... So I don't know anything about the person Mata is based on, right. But given that you'd mentioned earlier that this is a woman with albinism, Deandra Forrest, given the context of albinism in many parts of Africa, I think that that's what that's a reference to. And I think it's really important to note that this is a film in which, while the main character does not say much and doesn't have many lines and could be seen more as a mythical figure than a more traditional character, the fact is that she's being, in a way, almost worshipped or revered by people who are very dark of skin, in a cultural context in which we know, some people have been murdered for having albinism in some parts of Africa. So I think that's a really important thing to note here, and it's very interesting visually, and also from a narrative perspective. This film is really good. There's just a lot of meat for such a short little film.
Yeah, it's only 14 minutes long, something like that. And I agree. It's incredibly impactful on a lot of different levels. I can't speak to the cultural context of a lot of different aspects, but I think just coming at this film honestly, going, I don't understand completely what all of this is, you still can get a lot out of what is happening in this film from a lot of the other sort of contexts that appear around those issues. And even without the knowledge of the original space program, this is still a really interesting film about just the incredibly sort of audacious effort a group of people trying to dreaming about getting to the moon,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and whether or not it's successful, which you don't know at the end of the movie, it's an incredible dream.
I think that's important too, that this is a film that is, because it has an ambiguous ending, and also because it's very much not really about 1969. I mean, it is set there and it is dealing with things that really happened, but it's sort of like a
Yeah.
fanciful telling of it. There's this part being left open here of this idea that, well, like maybe Africa as a continent, or maybe Zambia alone, but I doubt just alone, would one day have its own space program that would successfully send African peoples to the moon or to whatever. This ambiguous ending really leaves this possibility of, like, if we really tried, to send African people to the moon, right? Like, that's a possibility. The idea that, like, it doesn't just have to be Apollo 11. Maybe all of these different cultural contexts could have their own narratives of this great achievement. Like, there's no reason to go to the moon
No.
send people. Like, there really isn't, other than just to say we fucking did it.
Yeah.
That's really the only reason. But there is a dramatic difference in the type of story being told here about what space travel means. There is a sense of not of national pride in the story that's being told here for Zambia, right? It's actually the opposite. Nation doesn't matter here. This is about something deeper, spiritual, perhaps. Whereas with the US one, while the film doesn't necessarily set this up explicitly, if you know the context of the US one, you know for a fact, right? Nationalism is a huge part of that conversation. And I think that's important for this film. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good summation of Afronauts. You should all definitely go watch this one. Our second film today is Z the Beginning. And this one's my baby because I am a sucker for teenagers with cell phones who produce ridiculous self-shot movies. And Z the Beginning is a film done by literally a group of teenagers in Nigeria. Some people might be familiar with their other film, Chase, which was like everybody kind of went wild over because it was like, how are they doing graphics this good with only a broken cell phone and a Lord knows how many old laptop and literally a blanket of green cloth on a wall. But they have managed to create something very unique and special, in my opinion. So Z the Beginning is a short film set in a post-apocalyptic era Nigeria around 2050 or in the 2050s, and it focuses on a main character who wakes up at the outskirts of this developed futuristic city and has a bionic arm, and he doesn't know where he is. Some other person comes up and is like about to steal from him, but he's like, and he basically collapses. Now this person that he meets decides to basically help him out and show him the ropes, and it's sort of just about their friendship right at the beginning, and then the savior is stabbed and dies. And then it becomes a, sort of action film where the cyborg is hunting down the gang that killed his friend and beating the crap out of them. Like I said, this is a film made by teenagers on a cell phone with a broken screen and an old laptop to achieve what is, granted, very amateur, with very amateur actors. When you watch this film, go into it knowing that. I enjoyed it for what it was. And I think it's interesting to look at the stories that these kids are choosing to tell with their short films. Sean is less enamored of this movie than I am, though.
I mean, I think in large part because it is such an amateur work. I mean, I don't think that they would necessarily disagree with that. A lot of this is them figuring out how to do things with very limited resources, and it shows. The bad side of that is, like, this is not what I would consider to be ready for prime time production. But the upside is that because you know how little they had to work with to make this, there's an enormous amount of potential. And for me, that's something would like to see them. I'd like to see them continue to improve solely on the basis that there is potential here. Maybe they get to do. I mean, it seems to me like this is a production where it's like a bunch of kids who get some other people that they know who aren't really actors to do a thing that they're doing with almost no resources and almost no money, and then doing the best that they can with those limited resources to make something that looks pretty good. And given what they produce, it's pretty surprising. I think it's really interesting that they have the guts to do something like this. Isn't just some green screen work with some backgrounds. They actually tried to put on an arm, like replace presumably his real arm with a cybernetic arm, CG cybernetic arm. That takes guts to do, because that's not easy to do even when you have a lot of resources. And while, you can tell it's not real, it's still pretty impressive how well they do to integrate it into the shots. I do think that the fight choreography for what I assume are not ninjas by training is pretty impressive as well. I think they do pretty well for that. You could see that they really tried to think through some of the fight sequences. I'm sure a fight choreographer could sit there and get really anal about it, but I'm not going to, because I thought that they did the trick pretty well. There's just a lot of potential, I think, in this film, and I think if they keep working at it and spend a little bit more time about creating story that's fully cohesive, they'll end up making really good films. I think that there's that potential there.
So I think what is also interesting about what happened is the fact that this ended up going viral. I don't know what made it go viral. Since that time, they were literally contacted by Franklin Leonard, Scott Myers, and J.J. Abrams. Basically, they got their dream haul. So now they have gaming PCs, high-end cameras, and everything else. So their next film should be pretty incredible. But to me, what's fascinating is how these kids are working within the confines of working within the limitations that are imposed on them by their circumstances. Like the fact that they have to keep the movie short because they don't have enough electricity or data plans to upload longer films. So, of course, we don't have the entirety of Z the Beginning because they're going to have to do an entirely different upload for the second half. And hopefully, now that they have all the good gear, they will be able to do that. I enjoyed this film, like I said, for what it is. And I think that it might be telling an interesting story. We just haven't seen the whole of it. But I do like that they are still imagining, they're sitting there and they're imagining a future Nigeria.
It's not a good future Nigeria.
It's not necessarily a good future Nigeria, but that's interesting unto itself. And I'm not going to comment on it because cultural context I do not have.
No, but you should comment on it to some degree, that Nigeria has like many countries, including the United States, had issues with government. I mean, this is the opening of the sequence, which is actually very well done. It's done with what looks like the combination of historical footage, news footage, with either some of their own narration or maybe cobbled together narration from news coverage, which sets up very clearly the betrayal of the Nigerian government of the people, which leads to some sort of dystopian future where there's cyborgs and all of the skyscrapers are falling apart, etc. And while we may not have the full understanding of the cultural context to see the specific references or allegories being done here, I think our understanding of dystopian science fiction in general helps us to understand that in a lot of ways this is commenting on a particular Nigerian context by doing what a lot of us have done in a lot of different countries, which is respond to your cultural conditions by talking about it through dystopian allegories.
Yes, granted. And I do think one of the most effective portions of the film, although it's very difficult to hear the voiceovers because they translate the voiceovers at the very beginning of, or they translate the commentary that's happening in the background. Clearly not direct translations because they're using actual footage for that beginning portion. the moment that introduction ends, and this is right before our hero character wakes up, there's a child speaking, and I can't remember what they say.
Isn't it them saying something to the effect of, like, our government betrayed us?
Yeah, it's something like that. It's a really effective moment because they let it hang there, as the footage of not good times, people running through the streets. I think there's police attacking citizens and things like that.
There's rebel control of some kind.
Right.
Yeah.
All sorts of things happening. That kind of fades out to black, and this very innocent sounding voice finishing off what you were just seeing. Yeah. And it's a super effective moment, and probably the most powerful one in the entire film.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Which is very cool to lead into what the rest of the movie is. And again, this is only 10 minutes, so you're clearly not going to get a ton. I think that introduction part is used very effectively. And I was very happy that the little girl clearly had the coolest gun.
Yeah, she did have the best gun. Yeah.
All right, shall we move on to our next film?
Sure. So our next film is Pumzi. This is directed by Wanure Kuhu, who is a Kenyan filmmaker. Does not work specifically with science fiction, but this film got a lot of attention in 2010 or so, really in the science fiction community, and especially the science fiction academic community, because it is honestly really, really good. A really fantastic short film. This was aired at the Sundance Festival in 2010. The basic plot of Pumzi is it's set in an indeterminate future, some 35 years after World War III, whenever that happened, which is referred to as the Water War, which I find very interesting given that we are now talking about selling water and treating water as a resource, not as a right. The main premise of it is that there are these people that are living in these facilities that is largely underground, that is protected from the supposedly irradiated world outside. People are providing their bodies as energy conduits by using bikes and other kinds of things, and they're collecting water and sweat off their bodies and their urine and other things to reprocess them into water again. And our main character, Asha, played by Kudzani Maswela, is sort of like an archivist working in a biological archive, and receives a mysterious package with coordinates on it, which contains a vial of dirt. And when she analyzes the dirt, she finds it has a high water content. This is very surprising because supposedly all of the outside world's unlivable, can't live there. And this leads to some conflict because she realizes that not only does it have a higher water content, it can support life. And when she tells the council that sort of runs this big sort of facility, this sort of almost Big Brother type facility, they basically tell her to incinerate it, get rid of it, don't, pretend like you didn't see it, move on. She, of course, does not. And the story essentially moves from there to her attempting to find the location of this good dirt, supposedly, that came from some mysterious figure. And we'll get to the ending, I'm sure, because there's also an ambiguous ending of sorts here.
I mean, we've seen quite a few people are writing quite a lot about sort of peak water. And it's a terrifying prospect for our future. And I think this one is interesting because two things actually happened. First, you had climate change, which was warming the earth. The water war came on the heels of that because water was becoming more and more scarce. And in the course of that war, clearly nuclear weapons were eventually used. So the surface is entirely irradiated and supposedly completely dead. I thought, as far as a dystopic future goes, that one actually doesn't sound completely inaccurate. Maybe I'm just the cynic, but it was interesting that that's where we started from in this interesting sort of space that Pumzi takes place in. And I want to point out two things. One is that the title is Swahili for breath. So the community itself is the Maitu community, and it's East African territory. What's interesting is that the word Maitu comes from the roots truth and hour. Colloquially, it means mother. So the seed that Asha actually plants is considered the Maitu seed from the mother tree. It is the mother. There's this interesting sort of, like hope placed in this otherwise seemingly lifeless seed in a natural history museum that is virtual because everything is dead. There's nothing living in the Natural History Museum, certainly. It's just a bunch of relics from this dead world, including, I think, the last tree. They have like a branch from the last tree in this museum. So Asha places this seed, the sort of, R-Truth / mother seed, into the dirt that she has received mysteriously with this sort of faith that it's going to grow. Because meanwhile, she's having dreams. And in her belief, those dreams are true. And it's interesting that this is taking place in a society that they literally suppress the dreams of the citizens, presumably because they believe dreams are dangerous, because they lead you to do things like escaping the facility to wander off after a probably non-existent tree with almost no water, because that would be not smart.
Well, and there's the other side of this, which is, dreams can often equate to hope. And this is,
yes,
even though it's a society that is, it seems what we would call a critical utopia, which is usually a utopia in which there's some sort of limitation, and so you build the best possible society in which that limitation is the center. In this case, resource scarcity, right? There's not enough resources, so you build the best possible society you can that functions, and this is what we have. But what we learn is actually it's all deeply controlled, and more than that, there is this sense that the powers that be, this council, is either one of two things. Either is outright trying to prevent people from finding out the truth, or I think the more likely, which is they're afraid of the prospect of the truth.
Yes.
Because there is this moment when she shares her dream, she puts her hand on the thing that reads life signs and shares her dream, and two of the council members start to reach out towards the dream until the central council member shuts them down. And I think that's really important little visual. There is this element of like, this is the best we could do. It's a functioning society and it works, but also this is a society that is afraid of change.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. And because I was going to bring up the same scene that you did with the reaching.
Yeah.
Other people want to hope, but they don't allow themselves that even tiny freedom because it could disrupt this critical utopia that they've created.
Yeah.
And others, it's interesting because there's like little moments throughout the film that I'm going to have to watch it like 10 more times to really fully encompass them, where it seems like she's almost distrusted.
A little bit.
Prior to any of the events happening. And you have no idea why. But clearly there seems to be some anger. You have to recall too that this Natural Museum history, completely empty. No patrons.
Right. Like, what's the point in going in there? Because everything's dead.
Everything's dead.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to look at that. Like, there's kind of like two things happening simultaneously. One, nobody really wants to look at that. Two, her role as leader or, as the curator of this museum makes her automatically suspect because she's essentially cultivating hope. Like, that's literally what she's doing in this space.
Yeah, she's clinging to the past.
She's also she's clinging to the past and also has this dream of the future. Yep. Like, she's literally cultivating things in this space.
She's the embodiment of hope.
Right. I think that is shown through that sort of distrust that the community seems to have for her.
Mm-hmm.
Except for one person who is the
cleaning lady. Yeah. And yet she's also the one that Asha really reaches out to in like blind faith, to borrow that term, right? Because when she's about to be caught, she puts all of the compass that she's got for her journey and all of the stuff. She puts it in this basket of.
She actually doesn't. She hides it underneath.
Oh, that's right.
Her space, and the attendant woman.
That's right. Excuse me.
Picks it up, knowing that clearly something is important. But it's an interesting coincidence. Why was she there just at the moment that these police were destroying the museum and arresting her? You know, like, and there's something very powerful in the fact that they chose to be destructive when getting her.
Well, did you also notice that there was a gender binary in how the society was structured? The security slash punchy McPunchers are all men. Whereas the people who run this society are all women.
Yeah.
So, and there are men in other roles that it's unclear what exactly they do. Like, there are men shown, you know, on the little bikes and things. But, yeah, the only people were shown operating in, essentially, you know, the brain bashers of this are men. Whereas the people that seem to be the ones managing everything are women. So, and in fact, there's this interesting idea even at the end with this ambiguous ending when she, you know, she flees, she takes the stuff and she goes, and she eventually gets as far as she can go. She gets to where she thinks her vision has taken her, and everything's dead. There's nothing alive, but she plants this little tree, and she uses the last bit of her sweat and her body to protect this tree from the harsh conditions and dies. And then what we get is this wide-screening panning out shot of this tree expanding and then this loud sound of thunder from across the way.
Rain and thunder. Yes.
And because we get this image of the tree fanning out from her body, and then we get the thunder and all of this, and the implication that there is rain not that far away. There is thunder. There is life, as it were. There's sort of like two implications to this, which is on the one hand, we're given this assurance that actually the Earth is fine. It's just going about its life. It's rebuilding itself while these people are stagnating underneath. But then there's also this image, because of the tree expanding out from her body, you know, she's very clearly presented as this sort of like Mother Nature figure, possibly a Kenyan variation of that, whatever that may be in a Kenyan cultural context. But I think it's a really cool image, this idea that she gives her body literally to birth the Earth, as it were. Yeah.
I agree, and there was a very good reason that when this hit the scene / screen in 2010, it was really impactful.
Also, one of the few African science fiction films, like, pretty much ever, that anybody of I mean, there had been ones previous to that, but almost nobody had ever seen them.
Right, and so this exploding on sort of the international stage that's an important moment, to my understanding, for African science fiction cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it. I've watched it numerous times, and it's a beautiful film.
I think part of the influence of this film in the West is there were other science fiction, fantasy, magical realists, other kinds of stuff out of the African continent, but most, at least in the United States, most Americans never heard of those. I mean, just the other day, to give you a perspective, you know, Jen and I were talking and going through this massive IMDb list and realizing there are all these really interesting films from various African countries.
So many, everybody. It's going to be such a good year here.
It is going to be fascinating. And I think for a lot of Americans, and possibly in the West more broadly, you know, their perception of cinema just in general is like what comes out in US theaters and what shows up on your Netflix. And Netflix,
so limited.
Netflix has been really good, because Netflix, we've started to see them partnering with a lot more international film studios. And so you're seeing films coming out of Africa and parts of Africa, you know, and India. We're seeing a lot of Indian film and all that. But this film, I think, for a lot of science fiction fans, showed up. It was accessible because people had bootleg copies, and it was on YouTube and all of these things. And suddenly it was like, oh my gosh, there's African cinema that is science fiction, and it's talking about things that we talk about, but just, you know, from a different perspective. And that had a huge influence. This was a film that made me really broke the mold, right? It showed me that there were other ways of telling these stories other than like Japanese anime, you know, and, you know, so.
Think about it. This was the year, 2010 is when we started the Skiffy and Fanty show.
Yep.
And I think we may have mentioned it even on a couple of the episodes. We've mentioned it a couple times over the years, but this is the first time I think we've really sat down to have a full discussion about it. You know, you and I already were trying to increase our awareness and, you know, like literally applying ourselves to the study of literature outside of the United States. And so to be clear, when I say that this kind of helped along science fiction, African continental science fiction hit the United States. Not that it didn't exist in Africa, but that the sort of larger awareness, particularly in the United States, was limited at best. Nearly non-existence at best.
The other big film that would have come out from Africa was District 9, which was the year prior to this.
Right, we had District 9, but that was a white man from South Africa, which, as we know, is a country that has some huge issues.
It does?
To this day, directing a film that hit the international stage.
Yeah.
And I think you can definitely make the criticism that there's a reason that is one of the earlier large pictures to hit the international stage.
South Africa also has had more of a film industry that has some influence internationally, whereas a lot of people are just, I'm being kind of brutally honest, most people probably don't know much about South African cinema just in general, but even most Americans don't even know that, like, there are Nigerian or Kenyan films. Like, they probably know that they must make films, right? But, like, if they could name you one, right? At least, I would say that probably 50% of Americans could name at least The Gods Must Be Crazy, which is a South African comedy that is deeply questionable.
Films ever, but only because I watched it when I was like 10 and was fascinated.
It is a very interesting film. It is very funny when you're a kid, and then you realize what the story is, and it's deeply problematic. Deeply problematic. And one day I would love to be able to talk about it, but I would like to do it with somebody who is Black South African, because while the film has a lot of things that I think are very funny and are slapsticky and work, the cultural context of how that film got made is just really screwed up.
No, it's not good. But now that we have ranged far and wide and through 3 very interesting and very different films, I think we are done, and that's it for today.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Sean, for editing up the mess that we always inevitably make.
You're welcome.
If you
pay me more.
$0.
No, times 10.
Times 10.
Perfect.
And listeners, if you would like to drop us a line to share your thoughts on what we have discussed today, or give us some other African short films to watch, that would be super cool. And you can do so at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. Email us at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com, or send us a note on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. Don't forget, we still have amazing book reviews at skiffyandfanty.com. And if you don't want to miss anything we do in all the places we do things, sign up for our newsletter at skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter. Oh, and meanwhile, go look at some pretty books over at instagram.com/skiffyandfanty. Finally, if you like what we do, please support us at patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. In the meantime, you can find me, Jen, at loopdeloo on Twitter, and on the interwebs and other places at loopdeloo.com for my excellent editing services. Where can they find you, Sean?
Best place to find me would be on Twitter at Sean Duke, or at The Joy Factory at patreon.com/The Joy Factory for joyful fun things.
Yay, joyful fun things!
Yay.
And that's all we wrote. Sean, would you like to make this awkward now?
I'm not wearing pants.
I mean, why would you wear pants in the middle of a pandemic?
I've already done that one, haven't I? So I gotta do a different one. I'm wearing a moose on my head.
I'm literally looking at you and you're not wearing a moose on your head.
It's invisible and his name's Charlie.
Oh, that's cute. Bye, everybody.
Bye. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.